G'day, my name is Nick, and in today's diorama, I'm really trying to push my skills as a crafter and create one of the deepest resin pours I've done to date. The inspiration for this diorama is a video that Mini Brick Craft here on YouTube put out a few years ago. I really loved the concept of the diorama and wanted to create something similar with one of my favourite characters, Godzilla. The end result that I'm trying to achieve will be something like Godzilla sort of surfing through the middle of a tsunami heading straight towards the Statue of Liberty. Getting started on the diorama, I first glued a few sections of XPF foam together to build out the mass of the wave. I'll then roughly sketch out the side profile of the wave, which I can then cut out and use as a stencil to transfer onto the side of the XPF foam. Creating these guidelines was really important, as trying to freehand the shape of the wave would have been near impossible if I went straight onto the hot foam wire cutter. Luckily, the width of the wave just fit into the foam cutter, though because it was so big it made it really awkward to try and rotate and pretty hard to stay on the guidelines. I definitely need to try and practice cutting out some curves in the future, but I'll be able to fix all the jitters in the following steps. I did a bit of shaping on the tip of the wave, just using a little hobby knife to create some peaks and valleys, mimicking the water that would be rippling and breaking in the wind. To help smooth out the rough hot wire cuts and begin to shape the water ripples that are flowing up the wave, I'll grab a jet lighter and gently begin to melt the foam. Next, I'll cut out a section where the Liberty Island will jut out into the Hudson River, creating a precise fit with the water's contour. While the jet lighter helped with the initial smoothing, I'll now apply a layer of smooth-on spackle across the entire wave. I'll continue to build up the smooth coat until it's a really thick layer covering the entire foam base. I can then come back in with my finger and start to rough out some of the textures on the wave. This layer of spackle creates a uniform surface that I can now sand and sculpt once it's dried, allowing for a more refined and realistic water texture. Before I do any more work on the wave, I'm actually going to take a photo of the side profile. I can then chuck that into Blender and start preparing the Godzilla 3D model. I trace the side profile of the wave using a Bezier curve. I can then fill in this curve and extrude to the approximate dimensions of the wave in real life. Then, using the extruded wave, I can cut the front section of Godzilla away from his body. The seam line between both parts should hopefully perfectly match the shape of the wave and mean that there isn't much of a gap when I glue Godzilla's head on at a later stage. Now that all the parts of Godzilla are printed, sanded and prepped, I just need to fill in the drain holes in his body. I'll do this using some Tamiya polyester putty. Since the 3D printed parts are hollow, sealing these drain holes is crucial to prevent any of the water resin from flowing inside and wasting material. Not sealing the holes could also cause the epoxy to overheat and boil during curing, which would definitely not be ideal. With both parts now base coated, I will temporarily attach them together using some sticky tack. I'll then start getting some colour on Godzilla. I want to make it look like he's about to power up his atomic breath, so I'll build up some blues on his dorsal plate using my airbrush and some inks. With the atomic glow all done now, I can move on to dry brushing some grey tones across the rest of his body and head. Once the dry brushing is done, I can move on to painting some of the more finer details across Godzilla. And with that, the paint job on Godzilla is pretty much done. With Godzilla all painted, I can jump back onto the wave and start getting some silicone on that to create the mold. To create a mold around the wave, I'll start by mixing up some 2-part silicone. This kind of silicone is usually used to create life casts of people's faces, but The thick consistency will make it perfect to stick to the underhangs and the vertical sides of the wave. After giving it a good mix, I'll apply a thick coat across the entire wave. The silicone is great for capturing the details, but it's not going to be strong enough to actually hold the mold in place. So to give it some more structure, I'll apply some plaster of Paris bandages. Again, tightly compacting these across all the surfaces. Building up a really thick layer will mean that the mold can support the epoxy when I fill it at the later stage. I will actually admit that this is the second time I've attempted this mold. The first time it just did not work out because I think I made the plaster way too thin, and I actually removed the silicone from the plaster mold to get the foam out. So this time I'm actually going to try and directly cut the foam out of the mold rather than trying to separate the silicone and plaster at different stages. This will also mean that the plaster and silicone will not move about as I try and, reform them back together, and should create a way more accurate mold. With the silicone all cleared out of the foam, I can then carefully position the body of Godzilla into the mold. To create the wave, I'm going to be using the Let's Resin Deep Pour Epoxy Resin. This epoxy is amazing for pouring depths up to 4 inches, although I'm going to be pushing it to its absolute limit. Let's Resin has pretty much every kind of 2-part epoxy resin or even UV cure resin that you could need for any kind of craft project that you're working on. So if you're in the market for some epoxy resin, check out my Amazon affiliate link in the description. Because I'm going to be pushing the depth limit of this resin so heavily, I definitely need to degas the resin. This will just remove any of the bubbles that were mixed into the resin as I was adding in the colouring. With the degassing process finished, I can carefully start filling up the mould. Now, because we sealed the holes in Godzilla's body, he's essentially become a little lizard balloon, meaning that if I was to fill up the rest of the mold with resin, he would want to rise up and essentially pop out of the model and float on top of the resin. To prevent this, I'm going to add a little bit of foam and a weight, just to make sure it doesn't move while the resin is curing. Usually when this much resin is curing, it will get quite hot, as it's an exothermic reaction, but leaving in the freezer will slow down this process and help prevent any boiling or cracking. While the resin is curing in my chest freezer, I'll start work on the Statue of Liberty. Using just a little bit of silly putty, I masked off the base of the Statue of Liberty. Then using my airbrush, I base coated it in some browns. Next, it was exactly the same process for the copper greens of the actual statue. The model was looking a little bit flat, so to add a bit of depth and some weathering, I grabbed my black oil wash. The mineral thinner in this wash seeps down into all the cracks and crevices, leaving a nice dark patina in the areas where dirt and mold would naturally build up. After a few hours, when the wash is quite dry, I can then grab a little foam makeup brush and wipe back all the black pigment from the raised areas of the model. This will then just leave all the depth in the recesses and cracks. Okay, so after about a week of nervously checking the resin every couple hours, it looks like it's cured perfectly, which is a real relief, to be honest, because I've never tried to pour resin this deep before, and I've had a lot of problems with resin not even half this deep. So I think the deep pour resin from Let's Resin definitely helped, and putting it in the freezer really stopped that exothermic reaction. Getting the plaster off with these pliers is not going to really work, so grab my rotary bit tool, just chuck a little bit on that, and hopefully I'll be able to cut through the plaster with this. Yeah, the plaster cast really did its job well, but it's definitely making it difficult to remove it at this stage now, but I'd rather have that than a warped and broken mold. With the plaster casing now removed, I can carefully peel away the silicone mold. You'll notice that the epoxy isn't actually clear on the sides and top, but that's not because of the resin. I think just the smooth-on spackle that I used isn't, well, smooth enough, to be honest. But yeah, to create a gloss finish. But I can definitely promise you that it is clear on the inside, and that'll all come out, as I said, and sculpt the wave in the next couple of steps. To add a more refined water texture to the wave, I'll sculpt in some flowing patterns using a rotary carbide bit. I need to find a proper solution to prevent the little chips of epoxy flying everywhere in my room, but for now I purchased this little pop-up tent which will at least prevent most of the chips from covering absolutely every surface in my room. I'll now just use my rotary tool to keep refining the watery texture that we created in the previous steps. Jumping downstairs, I'll grab my orbital disc sander and work on getting a polish on the flat sides of the wave. The sander kind of farted a whole bunch of sawdust from a previous project everywhere, which was kind of annoying, but that's right, I cleaned that up and kept going with the sanding process. Once I've got the sides sanded to a fine grit, I'll cover the entire wave with a coat of clear gloss varnish. This will really bring out the clarity and make the resin pop. I can now finally glue the head back onto Godzilla and see if all that effort of cutting the body in Blender really worked to line up the parts. There's a little bit of a gap, but that's okay, I'll be able to hide that at a later stage when I add some splash effects. And then I'm going to start work on the island that the Statue of Liberty will be positioned on. I actually tried this a few times, but I just could not get the island to fit perfectly into the V that we cut in the resin, so I had an idea to actually use the diorama as a stencil to cut out the exact shape and make them fit perfectly together. I did this by clamping a piece of foam onto the actual diorama and then cutting out the shape with a hot wire cutter. The cutter wasn't quite big enough to do this in one go, so it kind of got stuck in the middle. So I had to just ease the wire back out the same way it came in and then just repeat that process on the other side. After a little bit of sanding, the island was a perfect match for the resin. I'll first give the foam a coat of brown paint and then trace out the shape of the base that the Statue of Liberty stands on. I purchased a new static grass applicator and I wanted to try it out for this diorama. I loaded up the plastic container with some really short 1mm grass and then attached the cables into the device. By attaching each one of the cables, one onto the grass container and then the other onto a metal baking dish, which will hopefully make the grass stand up vertically when it lands in the glue that I apply on the base. I think that the 1mm grass was just a little bit short to work properly in the static grass applicator, so yeah, for some reason it made the grass fall in like a perfect 1-inch circle around the base rather than falling onto the glue in, a proper vertical state, so I'm definitely going to try it with some taller grass, but yeah, it didn't work out 100% how I'd hoped this time. Because I didn't apply any glue inside the star shape, I can add a stocking onto the end of a vacuum and simply just vacuum up all the excess grass while collecting it to be reused for next project. With the grass all cleaned up, I can then super glue down the base and add a little trim around the outside of the island. To mimic the effect of some trees that are growing out back of the real Statue of Liberty, I've got this miniature hedge-looking material which I think will look really good at this larger scale and will look quite nice as trees out the back of the statue. Moving back to Godzilla and the wave, to both hide the seamline and make it look like Godzilla is crashing outside of the wave, I'm going to create some little splash effects using some UV Cure resin and the same blue ink we used to dye the wave. I'll simply spread a little drop of the resin onto some silicone and then use a toothpick to make it look like it's a splash of water. I can then cure the resin and cut it to shape. Then using a little bit more of that same UV Cure resin, I'll secure the splash ripples across the entire outside of Godzilla's body. And then lastly, I'll just use a little bit of white paint on the tips of the splashes to make it look like foam and chopped up water. And now I just really need to glue down the Statue of Liberty, and that's pretty much the last step of the whole diorama. And with that, the Godzilla diorama is finished. I really tried to push my skills in this diorama and create something that was more epic and grand than I'd ever done before. If you guys have any other ideas about some cool dioramas that I can create in the future, let me know down in the comments. Anyway, check out the reveal.